All right, welcome everybody. We're live. We're part of the Bevry community, a open community for open collaboration and discussion. Today we're going to be discussing Vervaeke's lectures from the Awakening from the Meanings Crisis series. We'll probably touch on lecture 41 and also go primarily into lecture 42 and sort of from there kind of work our way into just the different topics that he went over. I'm joined today. I'm John Buck, and today I'm joined with Pleasure of Doubt, or Brett, and also Nick, who's off camera right now, but he'll be joining in and participating. So, since I think last conversation we had on this, we kind of went through some of the components to lecture 41, but there was a couple things that at least I kind of had made primary takeaways from that. That we can kind of go into a little bit further. One of the things that he kind of brought up is that in the discussion of whether human beings are rational or not, there is this component where people are holding, like, their definition of rationality is sort of at this point that would like not make sense to hold people according to. So similar to like there's, what is it? If somebody's unaware of some sort of law about, like, hey, no digging in this area or something like that, it would be somewhat unreasonable to presume that they knew not to dig in that area. So similar to that, like if our definition of rationality is like able to spot all fallacious arguments or be able to understand the true meaning behind every word that is spoken to them, then that's sort of a further level that it would be unreasonable to hold them to. So he kind of points out these two, like when there is some sort of mistake that occurs, there's two options for what is the cause of the mistake. Either there's a problem in the speaker in their communication or their forming of some sort of argument or whatever they're trying to get across, where they're like making some sort of fallacy in their reasoning, and so that's what's leading them to make some sort of conclusive error. Or there's the other component where they're like laying out the problem in an accurate way, but the other person was misinterpreting them in some sort of way. So it's like I think it was lecture 40 where he discusses the lily pad problem, where you have a pond and every day the lily pads on there will double, and so by day 20 the entire pond is full, and so we want to know what day was the pond half full. And so people, when they're kind of using their immediate responses or is just intuitional response, they'll say, okay, that would be day 10. But because every single day is when the lily pads will double, the correct answer is on day 19, because that was one day before, and then it doubled, and then it led to 20, or day 20, where it's completely full. And so the one way in which you could reason why the people led to that error was because there was some sort of mistake in their understanding of what the person presenting the problem was even meaning. Like it could be that they didn't catch the part of the argument or part of the problem that, okay, the lily pads double every single day. Like if either they didn't hear it or they didn't really catch the importance to that component to the problem, then that would lead them to make the cognitive error and saying, okay, day 10. So yeah, it's interesting to kind of point out these two different ways in which errors can occur, and whether it's in the delivery of the problem or in the receiving of the problem.
And in studies for this, you have to make sure that you're accurately testing, you're covering these bases, that you're not making, because if you're not accounting for this, then you're going to be potentially drawing the wrong conclusion, which I think is what he says spawned a lot of the debate back and forth in the science on rationality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of the thing too. It's like you can like elicit a fallacious response from somebody just because like say you and I were having some sort of conversation and I raise that same sort of problem to you. There's sort of this, I guess, criteria of response that is necessary when you're having an actual conversation with somebody, that if you were to go through the more longer term trying to process and fully understand where the fallacies here are, what are the additional components that might be necessary in order to reach the right conclusion, that we just wouldn't go through simply because we're having an actual conversation. Like, if you were to give me the lily pad problem, I would have responded in exactly the same way as everybody else. But if I don't know, like you were giving me the lily pad problem and I was told I would have to write it down, and maybe if you added an additional caveat to that okay, be sure to pay close attention to all features of the problem, and I'd probably be much more likely to get it correctly. And so in lecture 42, he brings up this S1 and S2 like modes of rationality. Do you want to kind of go into that, Brett?
Sure. So these, if you've heard of the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which I read several years ago, it was a really interesting book. I don't remember the details, but it was a really good book by I think Daniel Kahneman. I think they got a Nobel Prize for the work he did there. So we have these two it's called dual processing theory. So it's the way we process information. So S1 is the intuitive, highly associational, implicit processing. It's very fast. So in the lily pad problem, when you hear that, it doubles every day, but then you hear on, there were, on day 20, it was full, how much, or what was it at, what was it?
When was it half full?
Yeah.
And so you kind of make that association between half and 20, and then, okay, what's the half of 20? It's 10. Okay, there we go. That's the answer.
Right. So that's your S1 processing system. It's very fast. It's instinctive. And we rely on this. It's the way we cope with the world. We take in information, we take it in our environment, and we react very quickly to it. So it's essential. The problem is it makes a lot of mistakes. So we also have S2 processing, which is more deliberate. It's engaging in reflection. We're aware of it. So S1 operates in the background. S2 is where we say, wait, stop. Let's think this through. So I had this experience with the lily pad where my thought went first to 10. But then I'm like, wait a minute, let me take another look. And then I thought it through. I slowed it way down. I looked at the problem, and then I got to the right answer, which was day 19. So that was day S1 and S2 working against each other. So they're sort of opponent processing. S2 is there to protect against the impetuousness of S1. So that's the basic trade-off between the two. Now the problem with S2 is it takes a lot of resources. We can't in daily life just slowly think through everything, or we would be racked with indecision. We would, like he says, we would be overwhelmed by combinatorial explosion. There's just too much in the world to think through. There's too much we're doing to get that it would overwhelm our capacity to use our S2 processing for everything out there. Plus, things would really slow down.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I liked about, like, when he brought up the S1 and the S2, he didn't really present it as like these two competing things. He kind of related as like, think of it where all the time these are both kind of at work, but one's in the foreground and the other's in the background. And depending on the situation, you'll have the S2 say in the foreground, or it'll be in the background with S1 kind of doing the other. And it kind of at least raised like I guess a better understanding of like why these aren't necessarily okay. Like if these two things were like wholly separate from one another, I would have a hard time kind of understanding when it is that one is activated and the other's not, or is the other one's going to be activated. If they're both sort of active, just one's not as active, and then you can kind of elaborate further. Or like if it's a situation that seems to require S1 thinking, boom, I'm just going to rely on that. If it's a situation in which okay, the S1 thinking is sort of failing me, I'm going to kind of switch gears and go into S2 thinking. And part of it, what I was saying, like what might lead to that is due to, I guess, sort of a safety net, or like a sense of safety or comfort in a situation. Like when you're in extreme environments, like stressful, and like there's something right up at you, I think it would be very hard to kind of activate the S2 thinking. But S1 thinking would be exactly what is sort of needed for that. And so one way in which to maybe elicit the S2 thinking is by first making sure that you're in an environment, or like even conceptually so, right? Or within an environment where you don't need to quickly come up with an answer, you can think things through, and you can like, it's not dangerous really if you don't reach this specific answer. It's something that you can, like, he brings up how S2 thinking is more argumentative, where you're actually like weighing things against each other. Jonathan Haidt, in his book The Righteous Mind, he kind of raises, like, there's these two ways, like if we're presented with something, there's two ways in which we can react to it. We can go, must I accept this, or can I accept this? And so, like, if it's say you're of an already ideological predisposition, say you're a conservative or something like that, and then somebody presents you information for why, like, failures of capitalism or something like that, and you, there's a way in which you will react to it, like, okay, must I accept this? Well, must is a much stronger sort of level, and so, like, if there's a way in which I can discard this somehow, like, say study wasn't exactly proper, that I can use this, like if it's possible that there was an error on the study, that gives me room to sort of reject it. So, like, I don't have to accept it. But if it's something that's more like profitable for myself, like some sort of study regarding the utility of gun ownership or something like that, then that's something that is like, when I ask myself, can I accept this? Oh yeah, I can accept this, exactly. So I'm much more lenient on the types of,
when we agree with it, when we agree with it, our S1 processes help us to just say, oh yeah, I agree with that. And when we disagree with it, our S1 processes help identify areas to just go, oh yeah, no, look at that problem, let's just throw it out. And
right.
in both cases, we probably need to say, hold on, let's just stop, let's slow down. Maybe we will reject this, but let's just go through it a little bit slower. How big a problem is this problem? How much, what am I ignoring when I hear one thing I like? What am I ignoring about the stuff that I don't like? And like I've been thinking, like, in our discussions, we've been doing these discussions on the free will debate and issue. And, a lot of the time in, online discussion or debates, they're very fast and everyone has their positions and they're just sort of almost instinctively, reacting to one another. So there's a lot of S1 processes. But we've really slowed this down, really going through constructing argument where we pause and, create a syllogism. And, that's the S2 kicking in, where you have an idea, you have a flash of insight. That's the S1. And then then you say, okay, well, this is my idea. Now let's take the S2 processing and really see if I got it right. So they work together. And when, like you were saying, create an environment, I think that's what we've been doing. We've taken, like, I think 8 or 10 hours of discussion now on free will, and I think made some good progress. But because we've slowed it down, we've allowed the S1 insights and we've allowed for the S2 processing to come in for all of our sides, where we're challenging each other, but taking seriously what each other says, rather than just going on our gut instinct that pops up. I mean, yeah, gut instinct, I think, is S1. Whenever we talk about gut instinct, that's S1.
Yeah, for sure.
And well, I don't know if we want to do this now, but he gets into the fact, though, that so just like S2 protects against S1, we also need the reverse to really be rational, because the machinery of insight is based in the S1 thinking. So we don't want our S2 to trample S1 all the time. or else we're going to be trampling the machinery of insight. So it's about a balance going back and forth. We want both, we need both, and we should be trying to encourage and develop both, in terms of practice and the psychotechnologies and so on. Except I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Maybe we want to backtrack
Sure.
track a bit
Yes.
here. Well, I'm going back to 41. So we talked about multiple competencies so the early studies on rationality was looking at a single competency, that it's static and it's individualistic. But the breakthrough, I guess, was that we have multiple competencies that are ongoing and developing. And that, I guess, which competency applied would depend on what's relevant at the right time. Time. So sometimes we're algorithmic, but other times algorithmic processing doesn't work at all. We can't just think in an algorithmic way. If we tried to be algorithmic all the time, we would get to combinatorial. This word, we really need a shorter word, or easier word to say than combinatorially explosive. This is just the hardest word to say. But he's again pointing out that rationality has to be more than just about formal logic. There's formal logic, formal probability theory, where scientists in the experiments use formal theories that can be applied in only a very limited context. If we try to apply them comprehensively in my life, we're doomed to fail. So I mean, we do a lot of syllogism and deductions, and I'm a big fan of them, but we have to be careful that there are times where we can't apply syllogism, where we don't have that ability to be certain because the problem isn't defined well enough. So it doesn't mean we ignore logic. So logic is still important, but there's a time and a place when it should be used in a formal manner, and there are other times where we've got to go more to like inference and other types of thing. So other types of thing, and so they talk about, you can be foolish but highly intelligent, right? So that there's a difference between being intelligent and in being rational. They're not the same thing. Although, I mean, they're related, of course, but they're not the same thing. And we have plenty of examples. I mean, we're all smart people who have said really dumb things. So we're all susceptible to foolishness.
Right. Plus, like from the kind of studies I was going into earlier, I think there's another one that has to do with like the level of intelligence that a person has doesn't necessarily means that they're going to be more open to having their minds changed. Rather, they're going to be more capable of arguing for their original position than even
intelligence can make you more closed-minded sometimes.
Yeah.
Because you've thought through, you've gone through the arguments to get to your conclusion. So of course it's right. You're even more attached to it because you got there through this brilliant. Everyone's brilliant, right? Through this brilliant process.
Yeah, I wonder if that's another part of it. Like, if I think that I'm intelligent and I hold to a position, then I must think that must be an intelligent position to hold. Therefore, I'm not going to let go of that position because it's an intelligent position to hold.
And that's an S1, I think, type processing that's in there. And then your S2 is to come in and say, listen, I can always be wrong. Yeah, I'm smart, but I'm biased just like anyone, and I can make and we're going to come to bias and the crucial role of bias in a minute, or looking out for controlling bias. But yeah, we're all, being intelligent does not make you unbiased, so it doesn't make you error free. It gives you the cognitive capability, like calculation ability, to figure out a problem. It gives you the ability to, like Vervaeke would say, to realize what's relevant. But that doesn't, yeah.
And that's what I like about the sort of thinking of S2 thinking as argumentative, like actually thinking about it in like, well, what are the, would I allow myself to accept this position? Like, I'm only talking about these things that I would be able to go along with, or I'm just going along with it for the sake of the idea, just to see where it leads to. But actually, by having that sort of openness to the new idea, and to be able to see it kind of coming up against the other ideas in order to actually kind of resolve, and to, both to understand your own position better, I think, but also just be able to understand their position from their perspective. Because that's the thing. I think within S1 thinking, we're understanding their position so as to go about defeating it. Whereas when you're going into S2 thinking, you're thinking about it from their own perspective, or at least good S2 thinking, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting too. He pointed out these studies that looked at the relationship between rationality and intelligence. And so if rationality and intelligence were equal, you'd expect there to be a pretty high correlation. But he didn't go through the details. But what he said was the correlation between rationality and intelligence is only 0.3, which is, I guess, a relatively low. I mean, 1 would be an absolute correlation.
Right.
So that it, I think there's often times where we're irrational while still being intelligent. And I guess because intelligence is a little more your capacity for thinking, whereas rationality is more the process of how you go about thinking. So just because we have a high capacity to figure out problems doesn't mean we always go about it in the best way, I guess, is one way to think about it.
Well, I'm almost getting the sense that the way he's considering rationality is as a type of applied wisdom, right? Whereas wisdom almost seems to focus more on, there's no action associated with it. It's more about having a properly tuned relevance realization machine, right? So,
well, because intelligence is relevance realization, I think, for Vervaeke. He equates intelligence and
yeah. So I think the way that he
is post hoc. Relevance realization is pre. He's said it multiple times. It's pre any other further algorithmic processes.
Right. So yeah,
it's the thing we're front loading, and to
rationality
me, what trains that is what we call wisdom.
Well, he'll be going into wisdom further. I know I've heard somewhere that he like thinks about wisdom in regards to like having some sort of understanding of the thing. So like you can, or actually no, that like you can have knowledge to the where you know the thing, and then understanding is to knowing the like reasons behind the thing,
context,
or the salience to the thing.
I think in 42 he says rationality is a component, is a necessary component for wisdom. So I'm not sure that he would say that rationality is a subset of wisdom. I think it's more, if anything, it's the other way around, that rationality helps us be more wise. Because you can be rational without being wise, right? Like wise, I think, is more about seeing the patterns in a perceptual way. Like
his usage of rationality is very much dependent upon finding the relevancy of the thing, like which information is most relevant in order to apply it into like coming up with conclusions or going through it and error correcting with like not overcoming self biases or overcoming self deception. That's like one of its primary components to rationality, is the ability to overcome self-deception. Which definitely needs to have an understanding of what the relevant components are in order to work off of them.
Yeah. Another thing that I've been kind of playing with here while listening is mapping kind of these various tools he's highlighted onto the Cynefin framework.
What's that? Can you go over that?
Yeah, so it was a framework developed by someone, I think, working for IBM or one of the computer Silicon Valley companies. And I forget the exact sense. I think it was him trying to organize the business in a way that they could deal with problems better. But basically, it's a framework that allows you to split up different types of problems. And by splitting up different types of problems, you can develop the most efficient strategy for dealing with them. So the 4 categories are complex, complicated, chaotic, and obvious. So it seems like if we're dealing with an obvious problem, the best tool we have is that kind of logical, simplified, black and white, A, if A equals B, then and B equals C, then A equals C. It's a very limited tool for the types of problems that it can solve. And we have to be able to demark all of the variables at play in order for logic by itself to produce anything worthwhile. So then there's perhaps where the gap between logic and rationality is in the difference between dealing with an obvious system compared to dealing with a complicated system. So complicated systems still have predictable results. It's just that there's lots of variables and fuzzy connections between those variables at play. So we might say something like theoretical physics is dealing with complicated problems. And it's able to produce theories then that have predictable, well-coupled results, predictive results. So where it gets perhaps interesting is figuring out, so we have 2 other systems, chaotic and complex. Complex is a system where the end result is unpredictable. So basically,
for us at least, right? It's not making it like we don't have the capacity to predict it.
So no, I think that's the difference between a complex and a complicated system. A complicated system we can in a sense say we don't have the ability to have enough information to calculate this properly, but there is some way to calculate it. Whereas a complex system by definition is unavailable to us to kind of ration out a predictable model of how it functions. So we have theories like chaos theory in mathematics, thermodynamics in physics, where we have these kind of rudimentary models of how things work in a very pulled away sense. But the classic example is the reason smoke looks so bad when we try and 3D model it is because the actual motion of smoke is so enormously complex that we can't model it.
Wait, but how do we tell the difference between complex and complicated? How do we know something's complex and not just complicated?
So I would assume that there's black box mechanisms. There's literally, hard defined limitations on the information that is possibly available. The other quality of complex systems is that they have emergent phenomena, whereas complicated systems do not.
Isn't this sort of like how do we know if something is a complex or a complicated problem? Isn't that like the problem of P versus NP, where how do we know if this thing is going to be something that we could conceivably come up with an answer to, or something that we could definitely not come up with an answer to? I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding
that
P versus
likely,
NP.
I think you're on to something there. I'm not familiar enough to be able to map it well myself. I think perhaps a good example of a complex problem would be the hard problem of consciousness. Right. How is it in any way possible to get subjective experience out of only objective things?
Especially if our definition of objective things are things that do not have conscious experiences. And then it seems like you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot there, because like anytime you try to present some sort of answer to the hard problem, then you're either including some sort of subjective experience or I don't know, not actually reaching the subjective experience.
So, what I was trying to get at here is perhaps there's some connection to dealing with complex systems that relates to wisdom. And that this fuzziness that we are highlighting on like being somewhat unable to tell complex systems from complicated systems has something to do with the relationship between wisdom and rationality, and how they have this kind of mutually feeding into each other quality, and yet are still separated by some strict domain, right? They're operating in different domains that heavily cross over. I don't know. I was just trying to map.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm hesitant to just limit things like wisdom to the brilliance of being able to deal with like the hard problem of consciousness or something like that. Like can't we be wise in just everyday problems? I mean, we have this habit of like zeroing in on like the brilliance of,
I used
particular
the
problems,
hard problem of consciousness just as a single example, but almost every problem that we encounter is a complex one, right? The operation of the economy is a complex problem. We cannot predict the economy outside of extremely general and vague trends.
Wait, but isn't that because it's so complicated? Because it's just combinatorially explosive. It's just there's too much data. We don't have the power to figure out all the relevant details for making the calculations, and we don't have the processing power to calculate it. So why would we call the economy complex versus complicated?
Is a different sort of like, for complicated systems, we know what causal powers they have and like what they lead to, and this has causal powers, and then we know if we put them together, they're going to work off of each other and produce something. Is it for complex systems that we don't know what the causal powers are to things, and so we don't even know how through their interactions with each other it will lead to something?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So it has to do with the coupling of
so I'm looking at some other like I just a website talking about defining complex. I don't think that I think it involves too many unknowns. Not that it's necessarily unknown in print, like theoretically unknown. It's just like the economy is practically unknown. Like,
Right.
So I don't think we have to limit complex to just things that are like the hard problem. That complex is where there's just too many unknown factors, versus complicated is where we know all the factors. There's just so many of them, it's hard to deal with.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll probably your mic is a little low, so you're gonna have to shout louder to.
Okay, I'll try and talk
over
louder.
us. Because I realized I've been talking and I think, he was just starting to talk, but yeah, you're a little. Here.
So my point was just I was using overt examples of complex systems.
Okay.
But
sure.
Regularly throughout life, like our most mundane ways of navigating the world are often complex problems.
I agree. Yeah.
And you make a good point too, Brett, that like the things that we might typically call complex patterns or problems may in fact actually be just complicated patterns, but like from our own practical perspective, they're going to be these complex things just because they have these unknowns. But if it were the case that we could like figure out what the known parts of these are, then they would like move over into our complicated patterns. And I think that's kind of the same thing for most problems. It's like prior to us having even an understanding of what the problem is, does it move from, say, like this complex unknown thing into a complicated thing. And then once we resolve it, then it becomes sort of an obvious thing to the point where like, oh, I can fix this again in this other situation as well.
Mm-hmm. I think you're probably right, Nick, that being able to spot the patterns in complex systems is probably a big part of wisdom. Being able to have a particular insight into these patterns that work for us is probably a big component of wisdom. Is that what you were saying?
That was, yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I was trying to map it onto. Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
And then finally, another interesting point is that last category that we kind of skipped over, chaotic. And in the Cynefin framework, it actually, the way to deal with a chaotic problem is action first. And then through the action, we look at the results and then we
Mhm.
create a response. And that's an interesting one as well, because that, I don't know if Vervaeke has explicitly dealt with that type of problem where there is
That type of problem solving, the trial and error type of.
yes, and how it, and where we should properly make use of it, like in what
Mhm.
frame it makes the most sense to do this overt trial and error and almost a knee-jerk response to a situation.
Well, I wonder if he doesn't talk about it as much because we do that when we don't know, when we're like, I don't know what to do. Let's just try something.
It's like
He's
the
trying to,
default.
he's trying to
So-
figure out how to make it so we're better at identifying the problems. So how we can use these psychotechnologies so we can spot those patterns, have those insights that let us break frame and not just get stuck and then have to just say, well, let's just try something like you could, like that dot program, like the dominoes problem he talked about, where you have the odds, you have a checkerboard, and you have it was something like where you take out two squares, the two corner squares of the checkerboard, and you have to place dominoes on the board where you where each domino covers both a white and a black square, and people could figure it out in a trial and error type approach where you just count all the different ways. But the solution to the problem was realizing that there was an uneven number of now white and blacks, and therefore it couldn't be all covered ever. So that insight helps break the frame where you don't need to use the trial and error. And I think that's what he's focused on developing.
For something like that, trial and error wouldn't really work because you're not really like sure, you're trying the problem and then it's not resulting with the.
Well, I meant just counting, solution. Like trying every possible.
Yeah.
Let's do this formula. Let's do this combination. Now let's do that combination. Now and just count and go through every possible combination. That's right, what they were trying to do.
Yeah, I think what Nick is sort of going into, at least like what I was getting from Nick, is sort of reminding of Vanderklay references the spirit of finesse from Blaise Pascal, where when you're interacting with humans or other things in which you don't understand, you have to kind of like work in baby steps and like try one thing, see how they respond. Oh, they responded well to that. Okay, I'll elaborate a little bit, and then kind of go further with that. And then if they like suddenly stop like responding with that positive feedback, then you're like, okay, maybe I'll hold off on that. And that's sort of a more finessed way of approaching things, rather than, I mean, when you're interacting with a object or like a specific problem, it's not like it's going to provide you with any sort of immediate feedback in the same way that you would with say with a chaotic system, something that is like immediately responsive to your actions to it. Like if you interact with a checkerboard, it's not immediately reactive to how you interacted with the checkerboard. I mean, it's passively responsive. But I think what Nick's getting at with the chaos system is something that by trying to impose upon the system in any sort of way, it's going to update the system. And now you have to kind of figure out, okay, by imposing on the system in this way, the system itself responds in this sort of way.
Yeah. And you almost get right the Hegelian dialectic seemingly in dealing with a chaotic system. Although we could argue that in most cases we deal with it, it's at such a rapid pace that we don't even recognize the dialectic. But right, chaotic systems, what is that? It's a house on fire, or right? And then your set of actions governing this extremely chaotic motion of thermodynamics is intimately changing the dynamics of that system, and then it's changing how the system responds, changes how you have to then interact with it, et cetera, et cetera. But lots of
There's a-
examples that just pop up.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I guess, example that Vervaeke had of like how we could sort of, I guess, measure rationality in a person based upon how good of a cognitive leaper they are. Where like you present them with, like first, like the example was, first you present sort of this blank screen, and then you start adding dots and to the screen, and then it starts to sort of form this shape. And then over time, you can kind of guess what the shape is supposed to be. Oh, this sort of square series of dots in a rectangular shape. I'm going to guess that's a sofa, and bingo, you're correct. That's a sofa. And so the way that you can sort of track rationality, I think he was linking this to rationality, was how effective a cognitive leaper, like somebody who could leap to the conclusion, like making a guess, an accurate guess with the minimal amount of cues to prior to that guess.
Yeah, and I know I'm not trying to just toot my own horn, but I get in trouble a lot. I mean, my marriage got in trouble a lot where like my ex would like say something and I'd get it within a few words, and then I just start answering, and she'd be so furious at me for interrupting. I'm like, but I know what you're gonna say. But she's like, but I still want to say it. Anyway, even if you can cognitively leap, sometimes it's a good idea to just keep your mouth.
That's that moving further into the spirit of finesse.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
but yeah, no, that's interesting. The cognitive. So cognitive leaping is a measure of. Wait, did he say it's a measure of rationality, or?
Let's see. It seemed like that's what it was kind of getting at.
Or is it a measure of intelligence? Because it's sort of more processing power, right? It's how fast can you figure things out?
So yeah, this is within Stanovich's account of S1 and S2 thinking. Or wait, no, sorry. This is, I guess, Baker, inductive leaping, but Vervaeke rephrases it as cognitive leaping. So
and it's a type of S1 thinking, right?
I don't know if it is. Yeah, I guess
it's how fast you do it.
Right. Yeah, it probably would be a form of S1 thinking because you're making the associations with the pattern, and then like you're accurate with your pattern, and so you're working off of that.
All right. So he's bringing this up to show that, because we think about S2 as being there to protect us against S1, but part of what he wants to say is, hey, don't be so afraid of S1. S1 has a lot of uses, and it plays an important role. Don't be like, yes, S1 can get us into a lot of trouble, but it also helps us solve a lot of problems and gets us out of a lot of trouble as well. What he said is, it's predictive of insight. That's what it is.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The better you are at cognitive leaping, the better you are at insight. So if we shut off cognitive leaping too much, then we're shutting off the machinery that makes us insightful. And so we have to be very careful. So it's all about balance, right? It's about
right. Yeah, he brought this back to like when you make that leap, you're moving away from the particulars into the gestalt. So like you have all these dots that are somewhat in the shape of a couch. And then to go further than that, you're making that inductive leap towards, okay, this is a couch. But there are occasions in which we're making that leap and we're mistaken, or like we're just over extrapolating to at some point. But it's also the point that like most things where we're sort of uncertain, we have to make some sort of cognitive leap just in order to kind of work with it.
Right, and we don't want to shut up. Like the way I think of the S1 and the insights is the start. So we start with the insight, the aha moment, and that's important. So we want to encourage that, but then we still need to bring S2 back in. I think once we've had the insight, We don't want to just stick with the insight, because your insight can be dead wrong, right? Insights are great and they can be amazing, but sometimes they can just be terrible. So we still have to bring S2 back in.
Yeah. And I like, this is where I think rationality definitely requires some sort of reciprocal feedback from people that you disagree with, because they're sort of a check on your biases, since they have their own set of biases. But it's like getting a perspective from two, or getting a understanding of a thing from two different perspectives. And so if you can use that, then you can get a much better grasp of what the thing is.
Well, and good. And this brings us back to what we should be talking about, which is, so he was talking about the gap. So intelligence does not equal rationality. So what fills in that gap? And what Stanovich found was that what accounts for most of the variance, so the variance between intelligence and rationality, is the cognitive style, using bad psychotechnologies. Having poor mindware, as Stanovich would say it, poor, like, mindware is like software. And these are things you can learn. And so there's different cognitive styles. And what he found in his research is that the cognitive style that is most predictive of doing well on reasoning tests is active open-mindedness. And that is to train yourself to look for patterns of self-deception and biases in your thinking and other people's thinking. And this I identify, because we've talked a lot about this. I hold bias to be one of the, I always say bias is our common enemy. Bias, is what destroys discussions on the internet. It's why, we have so many dumpster fires, and controlling for bias has been at the heart of the methods I've been developing. So I guess, it's the super rationality. Yes. But yeah,
Definitely an unbiased statement.
I have looked into whether it is biased, and I've rejected it.
He's the Ubermensch of bias, where he has been able to step outside of the rule set of biases in order to recognize them in other people, but not himself.
But all joking aside, it's critical. We all have biases. I mean, they're inbuilt. And biases are very much, I think, he didn't say this, but I think biases are very much attached to our S1 thinking. They're our gut instincts. They spring to mind in those fast ways and lead to these, to these cognitive errors. So I mean, he talked about confirmation bias, where we look to confirm our beliefs. He talked about essentialism bias. I hadn't heard that one before, where you treat any category as pointing to an essence shared by all the members. That's an interesting one. Misusing the availability heuristic, judging something as probable by how easy it is to remember it. So we basically defined bias as misusing a heuristic, and now I define it usually as a cognitive error, like
well, that's the fascinating thing, is he's pointing out that these are the S1 heuristics that we use in order to, like, understand something. And so it's just, I guess, the over application of an S1 heuristic, or the failure to back it up with sort of S2 thinking, I guess, or something further than just a automatic gut reaction to the thing.
Yeah, because we need these, we need biases. There's so much information out there that we can't S2 everything. So sometimes we just have to jump to a gut, a generalized, if I know just a few bits of information about you, I jump to a generality about you, and we have to do that. Now, sometimes we have to push beyond that generality, but if we don't do that, we can't function. So bias isn't just bad. Like it does help us function. It's just sometimes it can be very bad.
Yeah.
Bias is what makes me eat the apple and not the dirt it's growing from. Right.
Yeah.
I like the taste of apples much more than dirt, I guess, Nick.
And so what, to be rational, we need to actively, consciously work to counter our biases, and we can train ourselves. So I've been working on like trying to develop psychotechnologies of discussion that help us control biases, and it's not easy. It's really hard, but I think it can be done. But what do you guys think of this? I like controlling for bias as a fundamental of rationality. What do you guys, where do you guys fall on that?
I think that it is most proper to basically, again, I like that Kneffin framework because in some sense it gives us domains where bias is allowed to operate properly. And then it gives us domains where it's a bad tool to use. And being able to figure out which problems are appropriate for bias, like which food should I eat, or right, what should I shove in my mouth if I'm hungry? Right, we need an incredibly strong sense of bias. Likewise, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I think there's a way in which you can so match that to what Pod was saying. Like, you control for your biases. That's not to say we kill all the biases within ourselves, or we're not getting rid of all biases. We're controlling them. We're putting them to good use. We know what our biases are, and we can now work around them, or we can use those biases to help us in some way. Like what the elephant and the rider from Jonathan Haidt. Like, if we can recognize, okay, women who are who drink coffee, they're going to be the best people for finding out what are the problems with this study on breast cancer leading to caffeine drinking. Like, that's an instance where the biases that the women would have would be highly useful in coming up with what are the problems with this scenario.
Yeah, the counter argument.
Well, yeah, well, you brought up, yeah, like that we can use each other to help control for our biases. Like, it's much easier for me to spot your bias and for you to spot my bias than for us each to spot our own biases. And so that's a cooperation we can do to work together in opposition.
But I know that whenever you find biases in myself, that's just a bias that you have on your part.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that goes without saying. Of course. But we should also remember with bias. So just because we have a bias doesn't mean we are wrong. But what it does is it increases the chance we're wrong. So that's why we have to confirm. So for example, I mean, if I have a prejudice bias, all Asians are bad drivers, and I see somebody. I have an uncle who does this quite a bit. Who every time he sees somebody driving really slow or bad, he says, "I can guess where they're from." And you know what? Sometimes he's right. But so it doesn't necessarily, just because he used a bias there doesn't mean he's wrong in that sense. But his risk of being wrong is quite high because there are lots of people who are bad drivers, not just Asian people. So right. So what we really want to look at is when we're using biased thinking, our chance of being wrong is much higher. And that means it's less reliable.
Well, I mean, if we're using the biased thinking in a domain in which it does not fit, I would say that would be true. There's the other thing in which where if the reason we have a bias is due to the success it has had previously in the past, then this might be an indication that this is a accurate worthwhile bias too.
Bias has a negative tint. So bias is misusing a heuristic. Using a heuristic properly would not be technically bias under these definitions. And like that's the way in science, science they use bias as error, like a systematic error or cognitive error.
Okay. So anytime this bias works out in our favor, that's not a bias. That's a heuristic.
The heuristic can be used appropriately.
Right. But anytime that we're using this heuristic and it leads to some sort of error, this is actually a bias. But I mean, they're the same thing. It's just the outcomes are what change what the thing is.
Well, so the proper matching of it to the context of the problem. That again seems to be so bias, and if in some way we can generalize bias as using heuristics in a domain that is not appropriate to use heuristics, then even if it comes out with a positive answer or affirmative answer, we can still call it a bias even though it predicted
Yeah.
correctly, just because it was not appropriate for the domain
Sure.
that we were applying it to solve the problem.
And so controlling for bias is trying to get to the right answer despite our high risk of error. So confirmation bias, where we just spot the hits, we remember the hits and forget the misses. We can then go out of our way to say, well, let's go look at those misses, right, to correct for the bias. We have the bias. We're still going to focus initially, probably we're going to remember those hits, but then we have to say to ourselves, okay, that's an unreliable system. Let's now introduce some reliability into it by correcting for it. Let's do it systematically. We'll track the hits, we'll track the misses, and then we suddenly notice there were a lot more misses than we realize.
Right.
So that's what reliability means. And so when we're talking about sort of skepticism and looking for reliable methods of inquiry, we're looking for methods that have a relatively low risk of bias error.
Yeah, and the thing that I guess I would be somewhat concerned with is that we're not. I want to make sure that we're applying the, rule that bias equals unreliable to the proper domain. Because if we're interacting with some sort of chaotic system where the only way we can get any sort of reasoning about the system itself, like a black box to us, is through our interactions with it, then confirmation bias might be the best heuristic we have to even get any sort of understanding of it.
That's
wait, hold
I
on.
was just going to bring up perhaps a somewhat similar example, which is I went shooting yesterday, archery, and with that counting hits and misses, it ringed in my head because I noticed when you said that, like how strong of a propensity I have to pay a lot of attention to the arrows that hit the bullseye and very little attention to the arrows that missed. Although there's a weird feedback to this as well, because when I do focus heavily on those that hit, it actually builds up confidence, and that confidence improves my shooting. So it's that bias is actually in some way working in my favor. Whereas, if I miss my first handful of shots and none of them are good, it'll ruin the rest of the shooting session.
So what you may be saying is that there may be some instances, particularly when we're talking about confidence, and that there may be an actual benefit to being wrong or to being biased in our thinking, and that's probably why we've developed bias too, because they do have survival benefits. They do have benefits. I mean, it's why
problem-solving benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, we're biased against the other. The reason why we have so much prejudice, we're biased against the opposite tribe. Well, it stems back from the day where the opposite tribe was really trying to kill you or steal your stuff. So if you saw somebody from the opposite tribe, yeah, you better well treat them like they're evil, because they probably are trying to come after you. Whereas today,
or they're
carrying
not pathogens, or
Yep. No, exactly. So there are times where it's not it's not biased against people from China right now to say we're going to keep you in quarantine for 3 weeks to make sure that you're not contaminated, because you come from there. Yeah, so there are probably times where bias is not inherently bad. There are many times where it can keep you alive or help you, like with shooting and whatnot. So the trick is, when are the times that it's appropriate? What are the times that it's not? Like you still may, Nick, want to, like, later, like while you're shooting, you may want to focus on the hits that increase your confidence to make you better. But then maybe later on, you may want to say, okay, let's go over the tape and see exactly how many times did I hit and how many times that I missed, right?
Yes.
So you may want to do
Also,
both. Yeah.
When my attention, so for example, I pay a lot more attention to the shots I missed right after I took them, because what it's doing is it's allowing me to calibrate for the next shot. But then when I go up and walk up to the target, that salience flips, and I'm no longer looking at the shots that missed to recover the arrow. Instead, I'm looking at how well I did. So it flips depending on the immediate problem solving and what is the flow of the action.
All right, it's just like when you're walking in the grass and you hear a rustling, you're better off assuming it's a snake and just keep your distance rather than say, well, let me double check to see if there really is a snake there and go right up to it and then get bit, right? So there's definitely times where the biases can help you. That's why we shouldn't, like, I maybe I'm a little harsh where I say they're our common enemy, but I'm talking about it in the times where they really are hurting us, because there's still there's still quite a
very
quite a
clear
lot there.
destructive effect to them.
Yeah, well, it's because they developed, I think, for survival reasons, but unfortunately, our brain can't always tell when we're in a survival situation or it's just somebody who's arguing with us on the internet, and they're not really a threat, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, all of Twitter is S1 thinking back and forth between people.
No, exactly.
Also, if you're trying to reduce the complex system that is a human into a complicated, predictable system, one of the best things you can do is induce a sense of survival, such that the person relies on their biases and thus their behavior becomes vastly more predictable. So you see
politics,
this as a manipulation tactic on politics, you see it in advertising, etc., etc.
I was just re-listening to our first conversation on Colts, and you had brought that up. Like, that was a mode in which to sort of to manipulate somebody's salient is by using the sort of metaphors that we're commonly familiar with, to do with like survival or like pathogens or diseases, things like that. Something Hitler used in reference to the Jews was where they are like this disease-ridden
creature,
like
a rat
that were like a pestilence to them. And so by having that sort of association that they were making, they were manipulating the salience of the German people there in order to kind of produce that's what I guess effective propaganda really is.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned advertising, and it's crazy like how much they go into studying these manipulative techniques and how predictable we can be. It's
how do you collapse the complex waveform that is a human into this collapsed pin-like, particle-like behavior.
But one thing I wanted to note is, so it's active open-mindedness. So a lot of people, especially in the skeptic community, the atheist skeptic community, a lot of people, which I include myself as part of, but well, sort of. I'm sort of on the edges.
Oh, only the good parts. That's how you are.
I'm sort of in the middle. Yeah, but a lot of people think just because I know about cognitive biases makes me unbiased, and they're dead wrong. I've said this before in other of these podcasts that it's the active part. You just having studied cognitive biases may provide you with a little bit of protection, but unless you're consciously, actively working to counter, I think you're probably falling to your biases. You've got to be consciously doing it, taking active measures. And I've worked a lot on this of like techniques to do this. For example, one of the techniques I use to avoid the bias of, where people, in any, in Twitter conversations and even online debates, people will conveniently like ignore the parts of the other person's arguments that they can't answer, right? So they'll just conveniently not respond, and then they'll focus in on the one part. I can answer you here. What I'll try to do when I'm having a discussion is force myself to sort of pedantically go through each and every sentence that they say, because I'm trying to force myself to answer, even if it's just I don't know what my answer is here. I have to look into this more. It's something I have to think about. But to consciously say, I'm going to go through each part. This part giving me a bit of cognitive dissonance here, but I'm going to force myself to answer it. I'm not going to give into that bias and do it. So, but it's a conscious, active, conscious action. It's not just something that's just innate. I still get the cognitive dissonance. I still want to ignore it. I still want to put it aside. And what I'll do is force myself to answer. And I think if all of us did that, I think our discussions online would be a lot better. Because
I wonder if it's like partially tied to the direct medium itself, because like with Twitter, it sort of like calls for an automatic response. Like you get this notification, okay, I got to respond to this. That's like very much S1 thinking, where like, okay, they made 4 points. Wow, this fourth point they made here is not accurate. I'm going to attack that because that's just wrong. But if in order to even like go through those other points, it has to like have this S2. You have to be in S2 mode. But with Twitter, it's very hard to do that. Like sometimes, like somebody will respond to something, and I'm like, okay, I gotta put that aside for later, and then I'll respond to it later because I can't. Like right now, I don't fully understand it, I guess, and so I want to look back over it later, and I don't have this immediate like call to respond to it, just in order to get a better understanding of it.
Yeah, so that's active open-mindedness, where you're saying, I'm recognizing I'm not in the state right now. I'm just thinking too fast about it. I want to think about it, I want to slow it down, and so I'm going to put it aside for later. That's part of being, that's critical for rationality. If someone's not doing that, they're not being as rational. I mean, you have all these debates. It's interesting. All these debates, like, for like, is Christianity rational? Is religion rational? Is God rational? And never do they define what is rational. Like I think it's really important to just think, what are the components of rationality? And I think Vervaeke's right. We often have these simplistic notions of it, and people just think, oh, it's just logic, but it's way more than that.
Yeah, what I'd love to see is some more work with the existential components to rationality, where you can make a type 1 or type 2 error, but you want to make the error that is less likely to bring you towards extinction. The podcast between Sam Harris and he's a simulation guy, Nick Bostrom. They went into that, and I was really captivated by that, because he's all about like, what are the existential risks that we're like constantly taking? Like, if an asteroid were to hit Earth, that would be a devastating existential risk. And so, even if we have a very low possibility, if we can make the steps to protect against something like that, if it were to occur, then that would be something that like we have to put a higher priority toward. And I think that's a component to rationality of like, we're not just making things based off of what we believe to be true or not, but we're also basing it off of what are the risks involved here.
Yep.
Like, if I make a false risk here, am I willing to work with that? Like sometimes you don't want to get somebody's name wrong, so it's better to just not say their name if you don't actually know it. Yeah. All right. So there's the other probably maybe the last thing that we'll kind of go over that I found quite fascinating. I'd actually heard this before from it might have been from Peterson, but all about how people people taking a test. I don't know. Maybe you want to go into that, Brett, where how the test takers respond based off of the feedback that they receive.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting experiment. Let me just get to my notes. And for those watching, there's a link to my notes. I've got notes on most episodes in this series, at least starting from episode 7. I think I missed 8, then from 9 right up to 42 now. I have notes. So there's a link to the Google Doc. It's like a 200 plus page document. But if you're going to go back and look at these, it can help find stuff. So this experiment by, I think her name's Dweck, if I Dweek. So she did this experiment with 3 groups of kids, and it's about the way in which we embody our view on intelligence and rationality, how we think of ourselves. So she divided them into 3 groups, and these were grade 4 students, and they gave them a test that they were all able to, a problem-solving test that they were all able to answer. And for the first group, they said to the first group, "Oh, you guys are so smart." And for the second group, they basically said, "You guys used a really great method." And for the third group, they sort of gave neutral praise. And what they found, and then they gave them they asked them, for example, okay, who wants to do more problems? And the group the group A, who had been told that they were so smart, didn't want to do more problems because they were supposed to be harder problems, and then they may get them wrong, and then they wouldn't be they would be shown not to be intelligent. So that it's priming them for showing that the intelligence trait is fixed. Group B really wanted to do more problems because they were primed to note that the intelligence trait is malleable, and group C, I guess, was neutral about it. And then they did other tests, and then they went back and they asked them, like, they gave them a new test that was just as hard as the first test. And apparently the group A, who had been told they were smart, suddenly did worse. Group B, who had been told they did good processes, did better. And group C, I don't know if they were the same or whatnot. And then they were asked to finally to write to a student in Germany to report on how they were doing. And the students in groups B and C both told the truth, but 40% of the students in group A lied about their performance. And I thought this was terrifying as a parent. How just the way we praise our kids can have these enormous effects on how they actually perform on these tests or how they see themselves. And it's really getting at that rationality is more than just the process. We define ourselves through our ability to reason. So, when we tell our kids, we shouldn't really, it sounds like, and I think I've done both to my kids, so I've got to work on this, but when we just tell our kids, you're so smart, we could be setting them up for failure later on. Whereas if we say to them, hey, you did that in a really smart way, or the way you went about that was really great. You figured out the method to solve this problem in a great way. That is going to set them up for more success. But anyway, I found it terrifying that they could manipulate these kids to such a degree so easily,
Yeah.
with terrifying results.
Yeah, that's pretty disturbing, and it's extremely salient given how I was brought up and looking at the consequences in my personality. It's like, oh, yep, I see how that worked.
Well, it's funny, like I can
generally
remember
told I
doing
was
both.
intelligent, and then
Like-
I lost.
Yeah. I can remember saying to my kids, oh, you're so smart. But I can also remember, like, I remember when my son did this great project, I remember saying to him something along the lines of, the way you went about this, the way you took notes and the way you studied for it and the way you prepared it, you did so great. So I think I've done both. So I hopefully haven't screwed them up too much.
One of the kids is screwed and then the other
Yeah.
one's golden.
No, it's just for the same kid. So he's just
Okay,
both.
good.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
interesting too.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I think I've brought this up before, but I went to a charter school for my sophomore and junior years of high school. And the style of teaching was entirely different. And it was all self-directed projects that you had to incorporate each of the normal fields of study into the topic that you were researching. So, right, you had to write a paper. For English, you had to do something with math, calculating something you were curious about, right? If someone did a project on skateboarding, they could figure out the math of how an ollie is possible or how it works, etc. And it was going to that school that finally, listening to that experiment, what it seems like they were doing was reorienting the learning experience from this static, almost essential quality to this very dynamic, process-oriented kind of reward system. And just looking at how enormous of an impact that made on me at that age, and how it allowed me to kind of reinvigorate this natural curiosity that had been, largely ground away by the normal schooling system. But a lot of other kids, it did not work. They just rebelled, and we're like, oh, we can get away with doing far less work, then let's just do less work. So
Well, I know I really do try to focus more on process than results. That like it, I don't know. I guess like he talked about the Platonic approach to philosophy, where it's about inducing awe and wonder, and then the Aristotelian approach, which is more about problem solving and just the method of problem solving. I think I'm more in the Aristotelian camp, right? It's the question to be answered that's interesting to me. Once I answer it, my interest just dissipates. Like then I want a new question that needs to be answered. I'm more transfixed by the unanswered questions than just trying to, like, I want to answer them, but then I need to go on to something else that's that's not answered.
I find myself often trying to come up with, the best questions, the most interesting question. And perhaps that's part of that cycle you're describing there, where the answer almost becomes so unsatisfying
Yeah.
that my orientation switches more towards asking the very best questions.
Well, it's kind of like people in video games who use cheat codes. And like I can understand doing it for a few minutes, but the whole point of the game is to slowly,
to
gain
have a
these things. Once you get
challenge.
overpowered, like the game's boring, right?
Boring.
Like, yeah, it's the journey it's the journey to get there. Like I want to finish the game. I want to finish the game. Like even then, I've been playing Dark Souls 2, and I found my interest in the DLC has waned because like I want to beat Dark Souls and I beat the main game, and I found my appetite for finishing the DLC was much lower than my appetite for beating the whole game, because in my mind I'd completed the game, and suddenly it just changed my approach to the rest of it, and now I've actually moved on to a new game. So it's interesting how this works, but it's a psychological approach, but it's interesting how we can manipulate.
Yeah. And
Yes.
so it's such a small thing to have such a large result. I think that's perhaps where your sense of horror was coming from there.
Yeah.
Especially since it's something that it's so sort of ingrained within our culture too. Like, oh, you're such a smart guy, or you're really handsome, or all these fixed traits that we kind of like compliment people with, or serve as like reward functions to do some sort of action. And just to think that this is just setting them up for failure any time that they miss the mark in some domain, and then it just disincentivizes them to such a vast degree as well.
I'll take that as my rationalization at being poor at receiving compliments. Don't set me up for failure.
Just so, and we should be telling ourselves, not I'm smart, but I'm good at problem solving. That's a better way of saying, of just even self-talk. And
that's probably for like negative like ways of framing things. Like the reason I failed at this is because I'm stupid, rather than I had a bad methodology to go about this problem, so now I got to figure out a better methodology. Or I didn't go about the proper process in order to reach the accurate conclusion.
It's just interesting. Like I just know for myself, there are times where I feel really smart, and there are times where I feel really dumb. And why?
Depends on who I'm listening to. Like the conversation between like Roger Penrose and Eric Weinstein or something like that. Like, I feel pretty dumb right now.
Oh yes. Well, when I listen into the Eric Weinstein server, and I just stopped doing it because it was too much of just having no idea what anyone was saying, and especially Eric, and it was too hard to do to myself.
You got to build up that speed in order to. I don't know. Some of the times I don't even think that Eric knows what he's saying.
Yeah, well, they're very technical in that. But I mean, just coming back to the Plato and Aristotle. I mean, the reality is we should probably foster both the sense of curiosity and wonder, or I guess no, Aristotle's more curiosity, yeah, and Plato was more wonder. Like they're like just that reaction I had to that experiment is of horror, which is related to awe, which is related to wonder, as Vervaeke likes to say. Like they're both, and that had a very dramatic effect. Having that sense of horror, it really hits in.
Hyper salient for you.
Yeah, and that the wonder quest is about that quest of anagoge, that meta accommodation that Vervaeke talks about, the self transformation, which is a good thing. Like there's less, I guess, of a transformative approach when we're just looking at the process, or is there? Like, I'm trying to think.
It's certainly interesting. It's like two different systems of going about, I guess, the world. With the Aristotelian, he related it to coping the information into, like, fixing it into our already set system. It's very much Aristotelian. Like Aristotle had his whole system, and then he had a way in which to sort of blockade and make everything fit within his system. Like he has this entire system of ethics, rhetoric, biology, metaphysics. All these things are all fit together within one coherent worldview. And then the Platonic or Socratic method is rather we're changing ourselves so that we can be more like this thing that we're trying to understand.
Right.
It sort of speak for itself. Yeah.
It reminds me of the two kind of levels of religious systems, where you have kind of the esoteric or mystical, where a lot of the overt dualisms formed within the conventional religion suddenly take on an entirely new context, or they merge into a single reality in some sense. But that in many ways is almost this awe, like inducing this awe experience. And that's totally necessary for a religious system, because the crystalline, conventional, structured form, the church and its power structures and all those kind of mechanical pieces to making a functional cultural system, they'll die without that injection of that mystical aspect. Right, and you will overly crystallize the belief system and fall more deeply into dogmatic forms, and actually end up killing your religion in the process of practicing it. So there's
sorry, without the awe or with the awe? With the awe, you kill the religion. I missed it.
Practicing it within a conventional frame without any mysticism. If you repeat it enough times without feeding the mysticism back into it, then practicing the religion itself results in necessary errors that will over time degrade and ruin it.
Well, like, I wonder what you guys think. Like, I've heard a lot of theists sort of make fun of, like, Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, who has spoken of, I think it's Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's a few of them, Dawkins, I think, who talk about their awe looking at the universe. And I've heard people scoff at that, but in seeing it from this point of view, it makes a lot of sense that it's that Platonic type of investigation, that curiosity, that sense that we're not, again, curiosity is more the interesting thing, but the developing a sense of awe and wonder into the universe makes sense from a certain inquiring perspective. And does it make, I don't know if you guys have rolled your eyes at deGrasse Tyson for saying that, but if you have, would these lectures change your view of that you get it more?
I mean, for certain, like, aspects of nature, you can't help but be in awe when, like, especially like you go out, especially if you live out in the country, you go out during a night and then look up into the heavens, like the infinite amount of stars that are out there. It's like, if you're not experiencing a sense of awe, there's something wrong with you, I think. But I can also see there's certain ways in which, like, the sense of awe is sort of overblown. Like, I know Joe Rogan, he'll go into, like, the whole aspects of like there's an infinite amount of universes, and that means there's a universe that's exactly like you, but it's different in some slight way. And then like, isn't that so baffling or something like that?
Wait, but why would you say that's overblown? I mean, say that was true. I mean, why do you think there's something sort of silly about feeling a sense of awe from that? Like, I can see the sense of awe from that. Like, just thinking of the vastness of the universe that's 14 billion light years old, and 50 billion light years across now, or something. Like the immensity of that, and compared to us,
I think perhaps John's point is that it's not visceral enough. It's like you're playing in such an abstract mental space that it starts to feel disingenuous.
Okay,
right?
okay, well, that's a different
You might
question.
be-
If
you might be
it's
familiar with
wrong, if they're lying,
religious
yeah.
people.
Sorry.
You might be familiar with it on the other side with religious people, where it's the type of disingenuousness, I at least experience watching, a group of Christians sing pop Christian songs.
All right, so you're talking about virtue signaling rather than an actual sense of awe.
Oh, I think the people doing that are probably experiencing something like awe. It's just that it's in such an imaginary space that it starts to feel disingenuous. You can't actually feel them experiencing God. It's like this idea of this cluster of cultural ideas.
Yeah, that's good. It almost seems more like the awe that they're inspired by is self-induced rather than
yes,
like something natural that they're interacting with. Exactly. Which I would say, like, especially that Joe Rogan example is something somewhat. It's like very much, oh, imagine this thing. It's like, oh man, isn't this thing so wild? Oh my god.
yeah.
But like when you're like out at the Grand Canyon or something like that, or even like imagine, I guess in certain ways your imagination can inspire awe, and it's based off of what we know, like within science, that I can see the like what there's certain like DMT experiences that you can like see yourself as just this microscopic component to the universe at large, and then you can kind of see the cosmic niggle, just being able to see kind of the utility of our own lives, and they're such a small scale.
In the Hitchhiker books, I don't think it's in the first book, but it's in one of the books of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books by Douglas Adams. There's a torture chamber where they put you in, so the punishment is, like when you've done a serious crime or something, is they put you in this virtual reality box that shows you in relation to your position in relation to the rest of the universe, and you realize just how insignificant you are. You just go crazy and go nuts or something.
And yeah, to your earlier question there, Pleasure of Doubt, the only time I think I would roll my eyes at someone communicating their sense of awe in that context is when they then follow it with a long diatribe, or preceded it with a long diatribe about a reductionistic frame where that awe overtly has no meaning. That's where I roll my eyes.
Well, I get it, but on the other hand, can it also show that awe can exist despite that reductionist deconstruction?
It almost seems somewhat contradictory then.
Yeah, I'm not saying the awe is misplaced. I'm saying that the rest of their philosophy, not properly contextualizing the awe and then still using it as an argument, is just eye-roll inducing.
Again, I don't know.
Like if they were to try to say that all spiritual experiences are just some subcomponent of the brain that producing this chemical, and then they go about how impressive the universe is and how mind-blowing it, how spacious it is there.
But hold on, I'm gonna pause on that, because the fact, like, I can see it, like, I don't feel this way, or maybe I don't know if I do. The fact that the brain could produce that experience can be awe-inspiring in itself, that we have this thing in our heads that can produce these experiences just based on the the order of particles and electrochemical reaction. Like there's something amazing about that concept. So I can see it. Like, I get where you're coming from. It seems a little silly, but I don't think it's as contradictory. Like, that's amazing that happens. Like, it's amazing that little tiny quarks can come together and form all of this. Like
Yeah.
you can get a sense of awe. And that's what the transformative aspect is. That's what inspires people like this to continue digging, to continue to doing experiments, to explore the universe. So there is that transformative aspect, you know, that it makes them want to learn more and study more, and they're not just throwing it off.
And I view all of that as totally necessary. Again, it's just, it seems then like telos smuggling or something, right? It seems like the proper response would be at least a humility about the limit of their own knowledge in the following description of their reductionist view of the world.
Sure, it could be, and I admit a lot of these guys do sometimes.
I can reframe
make
this exact
overstatements,
same
yeah.
critique towards religious people too. I'm not trying to pick on atheists. I'm just highlighting the instance in which I would have a propensity to eye roll.
Well, it's like where Vervaeke says that like our sense of horror and awe and horror come at that limit of where, I don't know, how did he frame it, that like our brains can't handle it, but it expands beyond our capacity to be able to take it in, that type of thing. And that's where we get the sense of awe, which sometimes goes to horror. And you can see how that could be induced through the universe or something amazing like the brain or God, right? Like I think they're similar in their enormity, that it just makes us go, wow. Like,
yes, my point is, we need to make that wow an important experience, because we are treating it already as an important experience by even relating the story of having a moment of awe and wonder that we found important. So if we then in the next sentence say there's no importance to it, it's just kind of like, what do you do?
Well, do they say there's no importance to it? I mean, I don't know if they would say
overtly. It's you know, and
you
again,
think it's implied, but maybe it's less
generalizing
implied.
in a way
That could be your
that's
system one coming in. It may be less implied than you think.
I was just thinking, I wonder if there is this component to human biases where if something doesn't have an explanation, it's somehow more awful or more awe-inducing. And if something does have an explanation, then it is less awe-inducing, or like that's like how we sort of map things, or like how they should go. And so if there's something,
although sometimes the explanation
mysteries
can
that
be
major
awe-inducing too, right? Like, aren't you sometimes like just like wow when you hear an explanation? Like, it's just like that something like this exists is just incredible. Like even just this experiment, you know, like it's fairly mundane experiment, but I had a sense of horror at it and wowness at it, that just this, like Nick said, this small little thing you could tell these people could have such a monumental effect on how they react. Like, that's awe-inducing to me, and it's entirely mundane. Like,
well, I mean, it's sort of like an overhaul of what you previously thought to be the case. And so in that sense, it's somewhat tied to mystery, maybe. What you thought to be the case was suddenly the script was flipped. Like, suddenly you're outside the matrix in that sense. And then that's what makes it sort of hyper salient.
And I totally agree with all of this. You know, it's like, yeah, one of the greatest experiences of my childhood was regularly having the experience of learning how something worked, no matter how mundane, like, right? Figuring out why the bottle made a sound when I blew into it a certain way, and what's actually happening to produce that. It was awe-inspiring, right? It does have that immediate visceral impact. The part I'm commenting on is then, how do I make the automatic importance that I perceived from those experiences part of my worldview in a coherent way?
Right. And I mean, I guess sort of the $1,000,000 question is, through bringing it into your worldview, do you, at that same time, weaken the awe that you might have from those things as you had prior.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Like if, like, I don't know, just taking natural theology, something like that, it does having this sort of like exact explanation to the divinity of Christ or something like that, does that weaken the power that his divinity has for people? I know that it's not exactly related. I was just thinking of that in relation to like the whole Arianism and like fully human, fully divine sort of arguments regarding Jesus in the early church. And I think that's an area in which they were trying to classify the mystery into something that was hard and fast, something that we could comprehend and understand. But the very act of doing that made it so that there were these other entailments that were ultimately disastrous to the Christian theology, to the point where you kind of had to resolve or stick with, okay, we may not know exactly how this works, but Christ was fully human, fully divine. And he wasn't just like a hologram, and he wasn't just some guy that God adopted as being his son. We're putting all these things onto this person, even though it seems like, at least from an outside perspective, as like, okay, that sounds kind of like a contradiction, or that you're just sort of covering it up with mystery. But there's certain things that are past our capacity to understand, and if we try to understand them in such a way, it leads to disaster. And in those circumstances, I think retaining the mystery is sort of the more safe bet, I guess. But maybe that's my religious apology that I'm taking there.
And it does,
Anyway,
yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to agree.
Okay, yeah. Well, we should probably wrap up. This has been really fun. I'm glad we kind of got through that. I'm looking forward to his later lectures. Like, he's kind of been going a little bit too much into rationality and intelligence and wisdom, and so I'm looking. I know he's got some like later lectures on like Heidegger and Jung, and so I'm kind of looking more towards.
I think.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's one of his later lectures too. So looking forward to those. Man, we're at already 43 next time. We're
in the final stretch now of the series of 50s.
Yeah. And then he's got his whole other series that he's going to be doing, and then probably another one after that. So
that one I don't know what really pick on, because that's specifically about the religion that's not a religion, right?
What were you saying?
Series.
Oh, his next series is about that?
I think I heard that somewhere, although now I don't know where I heard it, so I could be wrong.
Yeah. There was something, I think it had something to do with Nietzsche, but I might be somewhat mistaken on that. Like, I know he didn't want to cover as much ground in his next series, like only focusing on a couple particular things, and not kind of having to do this broad narrative and working on very specific things, so that we can kind of get into it.
Tony has been watching and chatting with us throughout this. Thank you, Tony, for tuning in. Says that, and he's got a book coming out, so that'll be.
Oh, nice.
That's right. Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. All right, cool. So yeah, thanks, Tony, for interacting with us in chat. That was very nice to have that sort of interaction. Sorry we didn't like participate as much, but yeah, we loved having you in here. And so yeah, if anybody wants to interact with us further, we have our links down below, and we'll be discussing, should be episode 43, maybe episode 44 as well, if it fits next week. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a great night.